Action is consistently at the center of anime's biggest shows. The most popular anime genre is battle shonen, and if you have action in a story, it's often filled with characters who can fight. I think this is the norm for good reason, but occasionally shows come along and break the mold. Like, what if you introduced a halfling rogue who, despite being a seasoned adventurer, doesn't have much to any combat experience? Dungeon Meshi, otherwise known as Delicious in Dungeon, has recently been a huge standout favorite of mine, especially when it comes to telling an old story in a new way. Likely because I make these videos and spend so much time thinking about media, I find myself more and more drawn to things that aren't just good, but also interesting. And this show is both. Welcome to a running series called Dungeon Meshi in Depth. My name is Pei, and today we're talking about when limitations are much more interesting than capability. So, to no one's surprise, a show called Dungeon Meshi is built around a common fantasy trope: dungeons. And the series starts by asking and then exploring a bunch of really interesting questions, like what would a dungeon as a self-sustaining ecosystem look like? In a world filled with magic, wouldn't it be viewed more through a classical scientific lens? And if monsters really existed, what would they taste like? This show, in all the best ways, feels like a magical safari. And if we were to realistically ask what it would be like to go into a dark, dangerous dungeon, you'd probably want someone who's familiar as a guide. This leads us to one of Dungeon Meshi's main characters, Chilchuck, a self-preserving, pessimistic halfling rogue, here primarily for the job. A character that throughout the story gets less attention and backstory than the rest of the primary cast. But all of this feels like it might be done intentionally, serving not only the story, but also his individual arc. But the characteristic we're focusing on today is his reluctance to fight. We're going to look into how this ties into Dungeon Meshi's plot, storytelling as a larger structure, and finally Chilchuck's character, because it ties into all three in a really interesting way. Dungeon Meshi is a story that breaks a lot of common storytelling structure and expectations. It demonstrates that telling can be just as interesting as showing. It demonstrates that a magical world doesn't have to feel mystical, hidden behind a thick layer of questions and mystery. It's a story where monsters are parts of ecosystems and magic is a type of science. Because if characters really did exist in a magical world, they wouldn't treat magic like it was some special different thing. It would likely be used as another tool and viewed in the same way we might look at electricity, magnets, or computers. There's a common argument in writing education that stories need to feel realistic, not be it. The pursuit of realism can very quickly get in the way of a story. But just because realism in many cases isn't fun doesn't mean it can't be. I think Dungeon Meshi appeals to me in the same way an outstanding documentary does, or a great video essay. Passion is interesting, and Dungeon Meshi is built off of that beautifully. So this is a story that really benefits from an intuitive realism, building from things that we understand in our world. That's why creating an adventuring group where people have very real specialties makes a lot of sense. Submarines have operations, weapons, and engineering departments. They have highly specialized people in specific skills because they're going to be stuck with them for a long period of time in a dangerous environment. So in Dungeon Meshi, when they're going into these dungeons, having someone that's specialized in identifying and disarming traps is really important. The main crew literally gets lost in the first episode, and it sets up the inciting incident. Chilchuck, despite not being able to fight, consistently contributes to the party's dungeon crawl. Which leads to the second question: why is this such an outlier? Coming back to that idea that realism can be fun, but it often isn't, I think a lot of battle shonen is built around agency and characters being able to contribute and participate. When every Straw Hat Pirate finds a way to participate in a major moment in the story, it's more interesting than having characters sitting around who can't do anything. When things exist for good reason to the point of becoming a standard, that's a trope, which leaves room for subversion. Because when you do something different and then do it well, that adds texture. Both of the fantasy stories I've done large series on use action as an asterisk, not the primary focus. I think it's a pretty agreed upon perspective that neither Frieren Beyond Journey's End or Dungeon Meshi are shows that prioritize action. They're both character and setting driven. Because this decision to have Chilchuck be one of the only characters that can't really contribute to a fight represents this larger writing prowess that makes me love Dungeon Meshi. Choosing to do something very specific and then doing it really well. This is the point in the video where I gotta start including some spoilers, so just a heads up if you haven't seen the show yet. With an ensemble cast filled to the brim with weirdos, Chilchuck brings a very sobering energy. He's practical, reserved, anxious, and aware. He pays attention to what is immediately in front of him. His tendency towards self-preservation is a great balancing act for the ridiculousness of the actions some of the other characters take. Chilchuck choosing not to fight represents these traits well. It's not fear, and while it does in some ways come from anxiety and his aversity to risk, it's also just practical and realistic. It's a skill he hasn't developed. It is not his job. Whenever I do character analysis on Dungeon Meshi, I feel the need to point towards this other channel, DM Punk. He does great videos on characters both big and small in this story, and in many cases when I'm talking about characters like this, some of the points I'm making he made first. He has this great point about how Chilchuck's character really comes together with two major reveals. First, his age, he's in his mid-30s, and second, that he's a father. There's something really funny about him consistently pushing back against people treating him like a kid, but his personality kind of perfectly aligning with this kind of old man no bullshit attitude. I think part of what makes Chilchuck's refusal to fight so interesting is that it seems to apply to so many different aspects of his character. Even coming full circle in the fact that Chilchuck chose not to leave the party. When other members were realistic about their funds or the possibility of actually saving Fallon together, they made different choices, but Chilchuck stayed with Marcel and Laios. But even given his private nature and realistic pessimism, Chilchuck is invested. And you see that in the multiple times he's forced to contribute to a fight, despite his limited skill set. He doesn't want to put himself in danger, that's not his job, but this has also become more than just a job. There are lots of parallels in the traits that appeal to both DM Punk and me when it comes to Chilchuck's character. He reminds me of the dad who gets coerced into getting a cat by his family, who's incredibly reluctant, but then months in somehow develops a even more loving relationship than the kids who are so excited to receive it. There's like this sincerity in that dynamic that I kind of feel whenever Chilchuck chooses to push himself outside of his standards and comfort zone. It's also cool because when he does choose to participate, he doesn't just magically get good. He figures out what he can do, and he does it. It's very in line with his character, and that energy is really nice because we get a bunch of big personalities outside of it. He's weird enough to where he fits perfectly within the group, but he's also in some ways the voice of reason. That's what makes it so cool when he plays along. On paper, Dungeon Meshi is chock full of things I didn't think I would be interested in, like dungeons and halfling rogues that refuse to fight. But all of these little things add up until you have this mountain of small story details that are just so expansive. It's not just Chilchuck's refusal to fight, it's also the attention to detail with Marcel's hair, or Laios saying cool before being horrified by his sister's transformation. It's in the fun secondhand account of Laios' party through Kabaru. There's all these little things that add up, and in most other stories they'd either be functional or insignificant. But not Dungeon Meshi. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next week.